You're listening to a podcast by Adelaide West Uniting Church.
Well, you just have to grandstand more, and then you don't have to turn your head as much. We tried to leave you hanging for a bit there to get you to grandstand.
Yeah, we had this whole setup where we were going to, just the quick yes/no was supposed to get you more off guard than what it did. But
We'll have to think a bit more cleverly about how to catch you. And
it's just too sharp for us.
yeah.
So this is the start of the last episode of the first series, which...
Can't believe we've got
Don't
here.
cry. It's going to be okay. There's going to be more.
The show...
Well, we hope.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the real question, is the resurrection real? We're not actually talking about Jesus' resurrection. We're talking about the resurrection of this podcast. Are we coming back for another series? Yeah. But that might make sense of a couple of things I said.
I was just thinking I need to go back and change a few of the things I said.
Yeah, I mean, I've enjoyed this entire series, I would say. It's, given that I edited all the episodes, I'm probably the most avid listener of the whole thing. Unless anyone watching or listening has gone through each episode more than about 3 or 4 times each, then I think I'm the biggest fan of the show by number of run-throughs.
Yeah.
I think we started with some really good intent and so forth, and we sat around, but we've changed for the video. We've changed where we sit and so forth. Lynn sits in the middle because she's short.
Yeah, because I don't want you to just be cowering away in the corner of the screen.
Lynn sits in the middle and James and I talk to each other over her head.
Yeah.
And then I'm left playing ping pong the whole time. But we've sort of got into a bit of a groove.
Yeah.
And we each have different ways of coming at things. We've agreed on a lot, but there have been also other times when we haven't agreed, and then we've wrestled through that.
Yeah, we haven't had any
helpful.
big disagreements.
The important thing is we still like each other, even though... Well, we can still sit in the same room as each other, even if one of us is wrong. And we're not going to say who is wrong, because that's for you to figure out.
It'll be pretty obvious pretty quickly.
So I think we've grown over the series.
Yeah, I've actually really enjoyed just watching just the format of this kind of naturally emerge over the course of several episodes, especially given how all over the shop the first one was in some ways, because we...
Well, it was a pilot.
Yeah, the fact that when we shot it, we thought we were going to exclude the bit that didn't have video, and then I left it in, but then didn't leave anything in for the people listening to know what was going on. But we're a little disorientated, so I guess you just have to join us in that. We'll all have no idea together, and that's probably the joy of it.
And isn't that part of a podcast? Is to be is the unpredictability.
Well, it's part of this podcast.
It's a chat. It's not a pre-set thing. There's no script.
Yeah, we even changed the question for this one at the last minute as well.
We did.
Yeah. We wanted to make it more edgy so that you'd watch.
Yeah, that's right.
So let us know.
Or listen, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah.
But we would like to know what people think.
Yeah, we would. We've had at least one person have a chat with us, but it'd be good to hear more people. Couple. Oh, okay. We'll have to hear about that. But yeah.
And somebody's even suggested, a title for one of them.
Ooh.
So that's great.
If you have any complaints, just email Lynn
It always comes to me.
awuc.org.au.
And I'll forward them.
Include the nature of your complaint in the reference of the email, so that
There was the time that I talked about decking you, and then when I'd heard it, I thought, I really shouldn't say that something. It has been a conversation, hasn't it?
I mean, I feel like it just gives people an insight into our working relationship.
Yeah, not to worry about that. I'm 5 foot nothing and you're taller.
Well, it's just, it's the life of the poor, browbeaten associate pastor.
Is that what it is? Oh,
I take up my cross and I follow.
On to the other duties as directed.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Which includes podcasts, apparently.
Yeah. How much of a curveball has that been for you?
This has been great. I've really enjoyed doing Open Ended. I think it's been a rich and rewarding experience.
Yeah. So I think, as we said early on, if no one else listens, we've at least enjoyed ourselves. But, but if you did enjoy it, let us know, and we'll use that as an excuse to keep rambling. So
That's right. And keep
good.
wrestling through those issues that don't have clear answers.
Yeah.
We can do that.
Season 2 will be a special price.
Oh, yeah, we're going to the subscription. Everything's behind a paywall now.
You're right. No, that won't be the case.
Yeah, but no, I thought this was a pretty good, strong finish to a strong series. So yeah.
Yeah, so thank you. And thank you, James, for all your work in doing all the post-edit and seeing it all that 3 or 4 times.
Well, it's legitimately, it's been good to listen to every time. I think you, when you were watching back through some of the episodes before they went up, I had the same experience a few times where I'd actually forget to keep editing because I was too busy listening to what we were saying because it was good. So, because that's the thing, by the time I get to the edit, I can't remember what anyone said, and hearing it all again, it's like, oh, no, this is actually really good.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
No, it has been.
And we're cooking up some curly questions for next season. So
Yeah, we won't see any of them coming. It'll be right out of left field.
That's terrifying for me. I mean, I started off this this open-ended quite terrified because I don't think well on my feet. I'm with 2 people that do, but it's been very gracious. There've been some long monologues of mine along
you
the
should
way.
see
I think.
the lists of information that Lynn has in
Oh,
front
I've
of
got
us.
a couple of Bible verses,
And I always
a couple
find-
of quotes.
I quickly scan them to see
Yeah,
if there's
I know.
anything I can pinch before Lynn can get to them, so that just to wipe
I
the
just
ground out
need
from under your feet.
something.
Well, you just need something so it's not all body and theology.
And we didn't even bring up Bart.
No, we
this
didn't.
time.
I was so tempted, but I thought, you know what? Let's go without him for a week.
And now we've just brought him in.
There we go.
It's been around the table.
He has.
But hope you enjoy it. We've certainly enjoyed it. Welcome to Open Ended. I'm Lynn.
And I'm Craig.
And I'm James. This week, we're exploring the question, is the resurrection real?
Oh my goodness. Lynn, notes, much? Holy heck, 2 pages of notes.
You memorized them yet?
I'm just looking for anything I can steal.
Yeah, of course.
The resurrection completes the inauguration of God's kingdom. It's decisive. Feels a bit.
I only had half an hour.
Feels a bit. I only had half an hour.
Together. I was preparing the service at 1.
You're throwing together stacks more than I did. I just looked up one verse.
Yeah,
and I
but
was
you
like,
remember you think better on your feet
yeah, maybe.
or on your behind, one or the other. For me, it's on my feet.
So
Oh.
if you
You're filming, aren't you?
so basically, if you lay me out on the deck, you're actually doing me a favour because I think better on the deck.
Yes, that's correct. Okay. I hate it when you do that.
I do it every time. I'm surprised you haven't learned yet.
It's been a while.
It has been. Because we did the first episode in March, I think. Yeah, I think we did one in March, 2 in May, and then it's just been a slow draw out ever since.
I don't think we've done one since August.
Yeah, August was the last one.
And then, of course, we've launched, and so we need to do this
Yeah,
one.
we do, because there's only one more episode between
That's
now
right.
and when this
So
one's supposed to go
this
live.
is it.
Yeah, so this is, yeah.
So this one is the resurrection real?
Yeah. No. Craig?
Yes.
Lynn?
Yes. 2 against
Okay,
1.
done.
We're done.
What is real?
Yeah. What do we mean when we say? I'm mostly saying no to be provocative anyway. My actual answer is I don't know and you can't make me know.
Oh, we will.
Okay.
We will. By the end of this podcast,
Well, you're more qualified than me, so I should really just battle authority on this one.
by the end of this podcast, we will have browbeaten you into dogma.
I was thinking about this because we talk about open-ended being wrestling with issues that don't always have clear answers, right? But is the resurrection real for me is clear. So we're not wrestling with something that's unclear. However, for the last 2,000 years, people have been wrestling with this. It's clearly not clear, and all of us, whether we're clear or not, or whether we're not, for our listeners, it'll be a case of we're all going to be talking to people that it's just not clear. So this is relevant,
And it's something that wasn't even clear, like in the immediate aftermath of Jesus' resurrection. So, like the early church, Paul is already writing, and Paul's letters are some of the earliest Christian writings that we have. Paul is already writing to say, no, the resurrection happened. So even within Christian communities, from the very start, there are people who are questioning the resurrection.
which is helpful because that means we can then read Paul's response to that, which is still relevant today. Again,
I guess we probably should go into what do we mean when we say real, because that's probably a reasonable place to start. Because I think for me, the bit that I'm uncertain about is not so much the significance of it or the importance that it plays in the story of Jesus, but more whether or not it literally happened.
Yeah.
And for me, that question doesn't wind up being particularly important to my particular faith, because there's so much other stuff to be drawn out of it. I'm much more interested in the theology of the resurrection rather than the literal truth of it, which I'm pretty sure I've said similar things in previous episodes.
So to clarify, it's almost like the difference between a fact and a truth.
Yeah.
Where a fact is like a point of data or something that historically can be verified as having happened, and a truth is something that we know speaks into the human condition and directs our lives and gives our lives meaning and purpose. Yeah.
Because I think for me, to talk about the resurrection, it's probably worth talking about what Jesus' death actually means to me, because within Christian theology, there's a lot of sort of an assumption that something metaphysical happened with Jesus on the cross, and I'm open to that. I've heard pretty compelling arguments that don't have that as part of the equation, and the main takeaway that I have from the death of Jesus is that this is what the world will do to you if you truly pick up your cross and follow Jesus. You know, picking up your cross, it's not going to end well for you. And I always take that as a challenge. If I'm not doing things that's not upsetting to the status quo and existing power structures, I'm probably not wholeheartly following the message
Jesus.
of the gospel.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But having the story end with, and then you get crucified and that's the end of it, that's not a good ending to the story.
It's not giving you a lot of hope, is it?
No. And something that I like particularly about the short ending of Mark is the fact that the ending of that, with the stone being rolled away, the women there meeting with an angel who says, "Yeah, no, he's not here. He's out. He's out there." And where that leaves you, where it leaves me at least, is in a space of wanting to go out into the world and try and find Jesus.
Yeah.
Whereas once you have and then he came back, and they were in this upper room, and he got a bit annoyed when they didn't fully believe that it was him and stuff, and then got taken up and everything. Like, that's fine, but it almost ties too neat a bow on it. The thing I like about the short ending of Mark is that it's open-ended.
That was clever.
The short ending.
True.
Yeah.
The short ending of Mark is almost a little bit terrifying because it sort of ends with Jesus out there, coming to get you. Yeah, and the longer ending of Mark, not that it's much longer, to me feels like it's written as like okay, if you really need to know what happened, here's what happened, because it basically just and then he showed up and there was a thing, he got annoyed at us, and then but having there be ambiguity around Jesus' resurrection for me, again, at least in the context of the short ending of Mark's gospel, is an invitation to go out and seek him out in the world, rather than just having to have all the loose ends tied up with the gospel story. And John, of course, ties up a lot of loose ends with his telling, even going so far as to say, that Peter got to make things up with Jesus and everything at the end, which and there's truth in that, but ultimately, humans like stories about what happens to people like us, and.
We do.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the advantages of John's Gospel, tying all the loose ends up. But if you let go of that a little bit, then the unresolved nature of it, I think, is winds up being energizing into action, which I think is that to me is why Mark's Gospel feels so fast-paced as it does. It's because he's trying to get through the story so that you can get excited and get out there.
Yeah, and there isn't much time from Mark's perspective.
No.
So that's why he does that.
Just to clarify for anyone who's listening as well, the shorter ending and the longer ending of Mark, you'll find in quite often in modern translations, not older translations, that textual criticism has shown that the earliest manuscripts of Mark didn't include the complete ending as you find it in the older translations. And so you'll find in, say, the NIV or the NRSV or something like that, you'll actually find a line under it, or it'll be in brackets or something like that, to show that we're not 100% certain that this is part of the original document, and this might have been added by a later. This is most likely added by a later editor, and so we don't consider this these days to be part of Mark's original gospel. It's still in there because it's a treasured part of some faith communities, like the Appalachian snake handlers. Have you heard of the Appalachian snake handlers?
No.
Okay, so part of the ending of Mark is you'll handle snakes and you won't be harmed.
Yeah.
And so they believe that if they have the faith that Jesus wants them to have, then they should be able to be bitten by snakes and not be poisoned. So they handle snakes.
That's a really delightful bit of biblical literalism. I can kind of get behind that one.
That is frightening. That's nightmare material.
And you'd really want to believe in the resurrection if you're handling snakes.
Yeah. But you brought up about the mystery. And I've just been listening through before the podcasts go up. I've been listening, and we've talked about mystery a lot. Because there is a mystery, and there is something in humankind that we always want to make everything neat, and we want to have the full story, and like you were saying before, we want the ending of the story. We want to tie up all the loose ends, but sometimes we actually take away the mystery when we do that. So there is something about the mystery that we can sit in, that we can I guess that actually speaks into our lives. We don't have all the answers. So it's less about me, it's more about God when there is mystery.
But it is deeply uncomfortable.
Yes, as well as deeply uncomfortable. Yeah. Yes, I hadn't quite thought that bit through, but you're right.
Well, but that's it's always the tragic thing, though, is the discomfort of not knowing feels agonizing when you're in it. But then once you have the answer, it feels satisfying for maybe a moment, and then you realize, I'm not going to be thinking about this anymore.
Yes.
Having wrestled through the meaning of various David Lynch films, I've had that feeling a few times, because a lot of his stuff is very surreal, and not knowing what it's about is actually what David Lynch wants you to take out of the films. But then once you read some commentaries and you come across one, you're like, no, that all makes sense. That's probably what it all means. Sort of loses its flavor a little bit, which, is very bittersweet.
One argument in favour of a literal historical reading of the resurrection is that if you want to be edgy, that is, if you want to be like, if you want to go against the flow and be on the fringes of society, challenging the status quo, then actually believing in the resurrection is actually more edgy than saying that it's more of a spiritual reality, because these days most people are pretty uncomfortable with the idea of an actual resurrection, and the easy answer to the story is actually no, he died, and it's a spiritual reality. It's a metaphorical truth that we draw from. So in one sense, like just drawing on what you're saying about, sometimes the truth is actually the uncomfortable one, the one that we have to wrestle with and it's difficult. I actually think the idea of a resurrection is something that's more difficult for us than the idea that Jesus just died and that we just believe in a spirit. It's like, oh, okay, so if he did come back from the dead, what on earth is the mechanism for that? Because we've never seen that before. And then he ascends to heaven. Like, that's weird. And there's this. It's edgy because it goes against the social norms. Not that being edgy is necessarily a good argument for why you should believe something, but
Well, no, but I mean, given the countercultural nature of the gospel, I think there's some argument to be made there. Not that going against the culture is inherently of the gospel, but more if it's not countercultural, then that's probably cause for a bit of a pause and reflection. I think I can't remember what I was going to say now. I had something, it was gone. I think for me the resurrection kind of gets pulled around a lot to sort of have this whole metaphysical, death has been defeated kind of a thing within Christianity, and I don't really see what the purpose of that is with the church as it is now, because the church isn't a countercultural institution like it is in the early church, for example, because post Constantine at the very and etc. I think if you are a legitimately countercultural community, then the idea of resurrection is one that makes it hits a little bit differently when there's actual danger of being killed involved.
True.
And even if you don't take the resurrection as literal in that context, it's still incredibly powerful to have it as an image of how the gospel will continue to live on, how the love that you've had for the people around you and your ministry, the effects of that will continue on, and someone else, and the good that you've done and the way you've inspired people will live on within them, and they will carry you with them. Which again is not to say that I think that that's all there is, but I still think that there's that to me holds a bit more weight than just some abstract notion of death having been defeated, which is odd given that people still die. At least in my experience, they do. I've known a few people to do that, and they haven't come back yet. So, and we could talk about rapture and the end of days and stuff, but that's not the same thing as coming back after 3 days.
Well, I think it also, what you're saying also raises the point that in our society, death has become something that's acceptable. Like we accept death now. Like as a general rule, death is considered to be a natural part of life. It's something that happens. Quite often, the view is that it's just the end and that's it, and that's life. But if you take the testimony of Paul, for example, seriously, like Paul actually links sin and death together. He actually sees them as two sides of the same coin, and that death is actually not something to be accepted, but that death is actually something that is unnatural and doesn't actually belong in God's creation. I think we've lost a sense of the wrongness of death, and so the like what you said, the message of death was defeated. Well, so what? Because we've lost a sense. We've actually lost a sense of how much death is actually the enemy. Death is this thing that's not supposed to happen, and it goes against God's intention in creating, and it's tied intimately to sin. One of the theological reasons that I think the resurrection is important, and when we were talking about this before, James, I differentiated because I said, is the resurrection necessary for, is belief in the resurrection necessary for salvation? No, I don't think so. I think God can save you without without you believing in the resurrection. But is it theologically necessary? I think it becomes theologically necessary, and one of the reasons for me particularly is having grown up in fairly conservative church circles. Everything was all about the death of Christ applied to my life, the cross of Christ. And it was all about the death. And it actually came to the point that Jesus was unnecessary. He didn't need to live in Palestine for 30 years. He didn't need to walk among us. He didn't need to be tempted. He didn't need any of that stuff. All he had to do was die. That was it. And then my sin is dealt with. So to me, the resurrection is necessary because it actually says it is not the death of Christ that is atoning. It's the life of Christ that is atoning. And in the very early church, the early church fathers, that's what they taught. They actually taught that it is the life of Jesus that atones us, not the death. Well, the death is part of the atonement because it's part of the process of life and death. Jesus lives the life of a human being, lives the life of a human being, but where we sin, he turns in the opposite direction. So where he's tempted, he says no to temptation, where we say yes, where he comes across death and disease. Instead of death and disease attaching to him, he actually reverses death and disease. So at every point of the human journey, Jesus actually turns it around, including death. So it's part of a bigger story rather than just one moment. And the point of it is that it's Jesus' life that is the atonement that actually deals with sin and death. And I think Paul actually says that in Corinthians. That's Matthew, which won't help. In 1 Corinthians 15. in verse 16, he says, if the dead are not raised, then Christ has not been raised. If Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile and you're still in your sins. So evidently for Paul, the resurrection is actually an important part of dealing with sin, not just the death. And then the whole life of Jesus suddenly becomes important, and then how we live in response to Jesus' life is suddenly important, as opposed to it being Christian faith just being an abstract. Like you get saved from your sin by making a believer's prayer, and then you're in, and that's kind of it. Very transactional. Whereas if it's the whole life of Jesus that saves you, then you actually, the Spirit has to be within you. You have to be participating in His life. You have to be, participating in His life. And so I think the resurrection is theologically necessary because it corrects a tendency in us to overemphasize the wrong aspects of the story and then become shallow in faith. But that said, like, I'm talking about truth versus fact, really.
Yeah. And I would say that I agree with everything that you just said as well. And I actually quite like, the way that you frame death and sin, because there's a temptation in certain contexts for people to make the argument of, we shouldn't intervene medically in some circumstances because it's against God's will or whatever.
Yeah.
But the call away from death in the pursuit of the kingdom of God is very clear that we need to keep working to address the issues of disease and death and everything, because those issues that cause so much pain and suffering in the world is against the vision that God has for us. And so knowing that we have to keep going until the causes of death can be, mitigated completely, essentially. Is an encouragement to, I guess, keep going with the good in the world, really.
I think we wouldn't have modern medical science if there wasn't a Christian sense that death was wrong. That death is something that and suffering, like, for example, within Buddhism, those things are considered to be your karma. They're what come, and there's an acceptance of them as part of your journey. And there's value in that, because there's the ability to actually take your suffering and use it to grow in compassion. For example, that's what they're encouraging. But a
more absolute acceptance is kind of numbing.
Yeah, exactly. I want my doctor to be a Christian and my counsellor to be a Buddhist. Yes, that's what I've always said.
Yeah, there's this sense, isn't there? Christians have always valued life and the life of all, and that's why Christians have been so integral in the starting hospitals and schools and all of that type of thing. They made that difference across the world because there is that valuing of human life.
Yeah, and it's so easy to forget because we're post-Christian. We live in an age where the Western world, in the Middle Ages, there was the battle against paganism. Paganism lost, Christianity won. Christianity won so successfully that the gods disappeared, and even our God disappeared because, we were so successful in killing gods, we killed our own as well. But that's the Reformation for you. But we forget that in the pre-Christian era, pagan belief around death is very different. It's okay to go and kill your neighbour because Odin says that their village belongs to you. You can actually kill and it's good.
And nothing like that ever happened in the Old Testament.
No, that's right. Yeah. Well,
there's another whole episode, or maybe a series.
But there's a definite sense in which, in pagan religion, death is a lot more acceptable, and almost validated as being good or something like that, whereas Christianity really challenges the view that death is good and acceptable.
Yeah. And part of that is because we value life.
Yeah.
And see see death as something that was not God's original intention.
Yeah. I mean, that said, the Imitation of Christ.
Thomas A. Kempis.
Thomas A. Kempis, yeah. The purpose of the Christian life is to prepare for death. So there is the flip side of that in Christianity as well. That the goal of the Christian life was to prepare for a good death, so that I think that's so you meet your Maker in a good condition. But it's also that there's this other thread running through Christianity.
And that reminds me of the thread that we've had, and I don't know how long, but certainly decades, where we're only on this earth to prepare for heaven. So that sense that our faith is really to serve us for the afterlife rather than now. And we talked about that in the last episode, which I forgot what it's called now, but are we all...
Why doesn't God save everyone?
Thank you, that's it. And we talked a little bit about that in there, that we can't just go, we actually need to live this life with purpose and authenticity and following that model of Christ.
And that's exactly the reason why I believe that the resurrection is theologically necessary. Like you need to believe in the resurrection, because if it's just God, if it's just Jesus died on the cross for your sins so you can go to heaven, what's the point of this life? Why bother? Like, why not just kill yourself and go to heaven? Like, whereas if it's all of Jesus' life, death and resurrection, then there's purpose to our life, death, and rising with him in the age to come, because it's all the imitation of his life, and it's all the in
its fullness.
Yeah, exactly. So it kind of it takes the wind out of the kind of theology that says that this life doesn't really matter, and it's all just like the earth and everything's just going to go away and we'll just be in heaven one day.
Which is very shallow, and yet, there are times in my life where I've probably sat in somewhere in that, maybe not quite as simply as that, but if I'm really true to where I've been, there have been times when, this will all be over one day and it'll all be good, without really thinking about what I'm really called to do here and now.
Yeah.
I mean, the resurrection says at the end of the day that death is not the end. And that gives us great hope, because death is, and as you talked about death and sin earlier, that to know that death is not the end, sin is not the end, the resurrection gives us this beautiful hope that I think helps us in this life to know who we are in Christ, to follow Christ in every way that we can. Talking about what you were talking about before about that being, it wasn't countercultural, but there was something.
Countercultural, I think that's what I said.
Yeah, okay. And so, am I living my life according to the resurrection, according to, death is not the end?
Yeah, I think there is a real piece that I think that the idea of resurrection can bring to a ministry as well, because I think we live in a world where we're so caught up in the legacy that we're going to leave and how productive we're being and everything.
Yeah.
And so the idea that if we don't get it all done in time and we die before our ministry is over, the idea that our ministry will continue after our death, there will be a resurrection of that of sorts. Even if we're not going down the we'll all be raised back to life in a more literal sense down the line. That I think is incredibly comforting, and does actually make ministry more effective, because I think it's really easy to completely miss the real purpose of what you're doing when you're focusing too much on the outcomes and the measurable effects of it, and the fruit that the trees are going to bear in this life. You stop tending the trees as much because you're too busy, looking for the first sign of fruit. And that to me is one of the great places that the resurrection does come in, is just if you don't get there in this life, it's okay. Things will keep going.
The alternative in the Western world to the resurrection of Jesus is nihilism. Like we're kind of left with a choice by the Middle Ages and then by the Reformation and the death of the gods. Without the gods anymore, you've got a choice between either God, as in Jesus, or nihilism, which is there is nothing and everything is meaningless. And resurrection is a much more it's a great working hypothesis, if I can call it that, that says what I do matters. There's purpose. There's actually purpose to getting out of bed in the morning because.
Yeah, although I would push back against that because that's not where a lot of the meaning comes from in my faith. The parts of the gospel that I find particularly motivating are more about finding the kingdom here and now, and that the glimpses of the kingdom that we get here and now are, if you've got eyes, you will see it. It's and the more that we're able to engage with that stuff and keep our eyes focused on that of the spiritual fruit in ourselves and in those around us, that to me often is enough because it's which I think is probably why the resurrection isn't quite as central in my faith as what it seems to be for both of yours, because as I'm sure everyone can kind of remember from the ramblings I did in the first episode, I've really sought to try and get my faith to a point where it's totally bulletproof, basically. And so if you knock out one of the big ones like the resurrection, it's no small thing, obviously. But if this is all there is no resurrection of any kind. Well, it's like I'm here to make the thin places even thinner if I can.
Yeah, but then if there is no resurrection after this life, then any option is as good as any other, as far as making meaning is concerned. That eventually leads to nihilism, where okay, you do it because you're looking for the kingdom in this lifetime. That's great, but when you die, it won't matter. Everything that you do doesn't matter because it's.
But to speak more as an existentialist than a Christian for a moment. In my experience, the way that we create meaning doesn't tend to be in the outcome of things. The meaning of pretty much everything in my life that's come to an end, and I've looked back on, it's been the process that's given me the meaning anyway. Yeah. And if there is meaning in an outcome, it's because the outcome was totally different to what I was expecting at the time. So whatever my ideas of the kingdom of heaven are, if as a thing that we're working towards and will be eventually realized, I'm probably wrong. Yeah. And I think that, when we get to a point where it's evidently arrived, whatever that looks like, I think people will look back and see that it was there all along in ways that no one would have fully realized, except maybe a privileged few.
And so you're talking about looking back.
Yeah.
And so there is like a perspective taking at some point, which allows it to have meaning, because if there is no opportunity for perspective taking, then there is no essentially it's a clever game of peekaboo where I'm pretending that this has meaning, but I know ultimately I'm just going to die and that there's nothing left after death.
Well, yeah,
but when you talk about
what is the difference between pretending that something has meaning and actually creating meaning?
Well, that's the difference. That's the difference between truth versus fiction, really. And it depends. It depends on where you sit in terms of epistemology and that kind of thing.
Exactly.
But ultimately, if we're just pretending, then nihilism is true, and we're just pretending to make ourselves comfortable with the hope that we die slightly less painfully, and that our existence ceases to be forever. I can't do that. This is why, to me, the resurrection is theologically necessary, because even you said, when you look at your life, you look back at it. Yeah. Look back from where?
Well, the thing is, you don't have to be dead to look back at your life.
No, that's true.
Which is the thing. And if the last 5 minutes before I die are meaningless because I don't have time to look back at it, but the rest of it's fine, I think I can live with that.
But where does that leave? Trying to find. I definitely agree with finding the kingdom of God here and now.
Absolutely.
We need to always be looking to see where God is at work in our lives, and where where renewal is and where hope is, and for me that's tied up in the resurrection as well. But I'm just thinking about a child born in war or in poverty, or in all those places of the world where it's really hard to find the good things of life. When you a child dies in hunger and dies 10 days later in hunger. I just, I wonder if some of that is actually our Western world,
Definitely,
where we can actually.
There's definitely a tendency as Westerners to be like, well, we've already got heaven. Like, we have cars, refrigerators, air conditioning. Like, it's pretty good. And so, like, we don't need heaven because we've got it already. And it is a very privileged Western position. And it's actually, ironically, not any different from the, now I'm trying to remember my first century sects.
And you're looking at me.
Sadducees,
Pharisees.
Yeah, Sadducees.
Essenes.
So Sadducees, Jesus confronts them about the resurrection regularly, saying, there will be a resurrection, and they're basically like, no, there's no resurrection. The kingdom of God is already here. Like, haven't you noticed? We're in charge. We've got everything going on. We're in the temple.
Got the control, power.
Yeah, like for them, the kingdom has arrived, and there is no future kingdom to come. Yeah. And so, from their position of privilege, there's no need for a resurrection or a future life. But for the poor Galilean farmer who, is being extorted by the Roman tax farmer and being extorted by the Herodian authorities and being extorted by the Pharisees, it's kind of like
this ain't heaven.
This life is a miserable grind until
the mental health rates in the West do tell a very interesting story.
They do,
because things don't seem to be getting better subjectively for a lot of people. Which is not to say that we're suffering too. Like, I'm like, we are suffering too, but like I'm not drawing an equivalence. Is what I'm saying.
It's different.
And that to me is a really important distinction to make as well, because if everything's so great, why aren't we happy? And that is the lack of the kingdom. The kingdom is the thing that would make that taste sweet. That does not justify or negate the immense amount of suffering in the world. And I actually think we should probably do an episode in future about why does a good God let bad things happen? Because that's a classic. But yeah, and so that's why the search for the kingdom is still a thing where there is work to be done. And the places I found it the most have been in the people where there has been struggle, not the people where there's children being bombed before they've had a chance to do anything. But the joy that you get from striving and struggling alongside people who belong to the same cause for you, or even a sympathetic one. There is immense camaraderie. There's immense joy that is there, and I see that reflected in the stories of the early church and the gospel. So, yeah, I can't speak for when there seems to be absolutely nothing, but the places that I've seen the most joy, there has also been a degree of struggle and suffering as well.
Yeah, I mean, we also have to be careful not to fall into the Western the myth of progress. Which is that by virtue of liberal Western democracy and science, we're progressing to a better future where eventually suffering and evil will be eradicated through the triumph of human reason and ability, because of the people who get left behind.
And also the people that it does work for aren't as happy as they should be. Yeah. But in theory, which for me is why that's. When Paul talks about not conforming to the ways of this world, those are the ways of this world. It's the stuff that will like the trees that bear fruit that turn to ash in your mouth. Not that. The real stuff.
When I think of my friends who don't know Jesus and don't have a concept of the resurrection, I see their lives being very much being about making money. To be comfortable, and they're good, honest people. They work hard. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with them or that they're doing anything bad, but there is almost a Pollyanna-ishness to it, where it's if you don't, or an emperor's clothes. If you don't bother to look and notice that you're naked, then you won't notice that you're naked. And I suspect that there's an inherent nihilism to their lives that they don't want to acknowledge or look at, because it's it was terrifying, because to stare into the abyss is awful. And this is why I think, like, again, the resurrection is at least theologically necessary, if not literally necessary. But just to move the conversation along a bit.
Before we get bogged too deep down into philosophy.
Another argument for the literal belief in the resurrection is that nobody would have been insane enough to start the Christian movement, like if there wasn't a real resurrection. So, like, would Paul be willing to be taken to Rome and tried with the possibility of execution? Would Peter have been crucified? Would you go to your own crucifixion to maintain a fiction?
That's right.
And so, like. And the case study that's often brought up is Richard Nixon and the Watergate thing. They couldn't even keep a lie for 20 years, whereas
or 8 days or whatever it was.
Whereas you've got a whole body of people who knew Jesus in person, who then are willing to actually be tortured, suffer. They sell everything they have, and they give it away, and they throw their whole life away to follow this movement. And the argument being, like, would you do that if it was for a lie?
Well, it depends, because if the resurrection was the only thing that they were dying for, then I would find that more. I do find that somewhat compelling, but I would find it more compelling if it was
the only thing.
The only thing, but it's not, because it was the life and the experience they had with Jesus.
But they often taught. Like Paul, for example, taught at the core of his teaching the resurrection, and
Well, is that a Greek approach to content of teaching? Because does that necessarily mean that it's a logical, rational, observable, material fact, or is it that it's a crucial part of the story? Which, again, and I'm firmly on the I don't know side of things.
Yeah,
I'm not saying
I wouldn't be comfortable dying for a nice rhetorical point, and I don't think Paul was either. I think Paul believed in the physical, bodily resurrection of Jesus, and put his life on the line for it. I mean, I think the same argument could be made for the apostles. I think that
well, they weren't. They were this scared rabble of people leading up to Jesus' death. I mean, we have people,
and even after Jesus' death, until Jesus comes to them, they're getting ready to break up.
They're hiding.
They're getting ready to break up the band.
And so I think the resurrection is actually what turned that around. So that's when Jesus talked about this. That's right. Do you remember when he said da-da-da and we didn't understand it? We thought, the rabbi's just talking again. So they actually, for them, it all made sense through the resurrection, not through his death, because the band was, that's a good picture. I might use that in a sermon one day. The band breakup was about to happen, and then suddenly this motley group changed into people with conviction and so for me that's probably why I find that I do find that more compelling than most things, because I'm trying to get a group of people organised and doing something all at once. It's like herding cats.
It's one of the
that's Jesus' biggest miracle.
It's actually one of the most compelling arguments, and I've been dying to throw this spanner in the works. I've been sitting here like I thought I'll reel you guys in and then throw a spanner in the works.
Yes.
I'm only a half-hearted devil's advocate.
They didn't recognise Jesus when he came back.
Yeah.
He looked different.
Yes. What does that mean?
Oh, I was actually thinking about that.
Oh, right.
Again, more theologically than literally.
Yeah.
Because, like I said, we like stories about us, so the Book of Revelation is more about the end of the age rather than the ultimate end of days and everything. That's my reading, at least, the one I subscribe to, rather. And so the resurrection fitting into sort of a more broader sort of Christian death and rebirth cycle kind of a thing. We can recognize when things are coming to a close because they start looking like the Book of Revelation. I think we've seen that in the last few years yeah. But then I think you can also start
You heard it
recognizing...
here first, folks. The end is coming.
Oh, no, the end is been.
Hold a placard up now.
Sorry, I just wanted to be.
The end is so 3 years ago.
Every age has seen it, haven't they? Every age.
Sorry, I just had to throw that in there.
That's all right. But we can also recognize when things are starting anew because they start to look like the resurrection. And one of the places that I've recognized it, a little bit to toot my own horn, is in Church Online. Because when I was reading through just the end of Mark, just to make sure I had, I was actually being scripturally accurate.
Yes.
There were a few parallels that jumped out just because the description of Jesus' resurrected life is so brief. You kind of just get this real brief impression of everything. But the brief impression, I was like, it's a bit like what happened with Church Online because we just started doing it. We just put Church Online because we had to. People couldn't meet in person. And then after we kept doing it for a while, we looked back and suddenly we recognized it. And it felt a lot like the moment of, wait a minute, that was Jesus.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so the idea that you'll encounter the resurrected new thing that is continuing, the ministry, the body of Christ that does not die.
Yeah.
When you encounter that anew after everything has fallen apart and appears to have died, it suddenly looks different.
Yeah.
And you don't recognize it until you've been walking and talking with it for a while. And
I think that's what you're saying also raises a really important point, which I think we discussed beforehand, but Lynn wasn't part of. That
I was out ministering, leading a church service at a nursing home.
that a literal belief in the resurrection shouldn't become dogmatic to the point that it blinds us to the spiritual resurrections that happen. They are both valid realities, and the whole concept of Christian redemption is actually every redemption is a moment of resurrection, where out of the awfulness that was the disease of COVID came a beautiful thing, which is Church Online, which has reached people that we never thought about before, and COVID actually opened our eyes and started a ministry to people who weren't getting that ministry, out of the brokenness that happened with the youth group and what happened in the past. God has actually used and taken some of that brokenness and actually turned it into a strength, and that's resurrection power at work, where something that is diseased and broken becomes the source of health and strength. That's resurrection, and so. I definitely wouldn't want to leave our listeners feeling like it's either the bodily resurrection of Christ or seeing the spiritual reality of the resurrection in everyday life in every place and all those sort of things. Like, it shouldn't be a contest, really. But going back to the resurrection of Jesus and the disciples not recognizing Jesus. I wanted to talk about that because, in Paul talks about the resurrection body not being the same as the body that we live in now. He says, in order for the plant to grow, the seed has to fall into the ground and die, and then it grows into a new plant. And he says that the body of Adam is flesh, but the body of the new Adam is a spiritual body. And nobody's entirely sure what he means by this, but there seems to be a link to this fact that, like, on the road to Emmaus, Jesus is talking to the disciples for ages, and they don't get it. They don't see. They're like, this guy is amazing. He really knows this Jesus stuff. I wonder where he got his knowledge from. Right. And then he opens their eyes. He goes and he appears in the upper room, and he has to put their hands in his wound because, it's like touch. Yeah. Because they almost don't believe that it's him, because there is this difference about him as resurrected, and
it was too good to be true.
Yeah,
wasn't it?
Yeah, but the implausibility of the resurrection is built into the resurrection story. So
it just, unless I feel. It is going to be too good to be true. Yeah. Isn't it? It's sort of, I almost need to tangibly do something.
But I mean, going to what I was saying before about just the way that things resurrect and the body of Christ resurrects, the wounds of the death are still in the thing. The same way that COVID will always be in the DNA of Church Online. We will always.
That's where it started.
Yeah.
And I don't know how, but I think that will always be evident in there somewhere if you know how to pull it apart and analyze it. I think there's going to be some effect.
Because that was the struggle that caused it.
Yeah, and so I think if someone in a different context did the exact same thing, it would probably feel different because it didn't start up. It didn't have the same. It come out of the same death.
And in a way, you wouldn't want those scars not to be there. I think.
Yeah.
Something to do with the struggle and the journey of redemption and resurrection.
I actually wanting the scars to be there. There's a quick little tangent. It just popped into my head that I want to go on. I have a kind of scar. I did not injure myself to do this, but I did give myself a scar because I wanted one from a past experience. So the pants I'm wearing at the moment, if you're watching on YouTube, you'll be able to see this. But I've got an elephant tattoo on my left ankle because from the ages of, basically from when I hit puberty up until my late 20s, I suffered from pretty severe depression. Went through some really good therapy and that cleared it up a lot, like it was night and day. But I wanted a marker of what I'd been through. And so the elephant was actually an image that had come up through the therapy. And so I got that tattooed on my left ankle, which is the foot that I use to push off of. It's if I high jump, I push with my left foot, I skateboard left-footed, all that stuff.
And people might ask, why would you want a reminder?
Because, I was very particular about the reminder because I went with a symbol of the healing rather than a symbol of the struggle itself. Because, the steadiness of the elephant was something that I learned to integrate into my own being and everything. So in a way, me with this tattoo is my resurrected body from that. So
are the scars of COVID on Church Online the marks of healing as well?
Well, I mean, I haven't changed the titles or the opening music or anything as of the recording of this, so...
But it's interesting, isn't it? I was at an aged care facility this morning leading a service, and there had been COVID once again. So I was back in a mask, and I haven't worn a mask for a while, and it's very hard to breathe in the mask. But it's just a reminder that this continues on. You know, COVID is not going away, and we don't talk about the deaths of COVID anymore. But I have looked it up a couple of times this year, and I've been staggered by how many people are still dying by the main cause being COVID. So the scar that we have for Church Online is actually still a scourge on the world. So it is still there in that sense as well. But we have this hope, and I think the resurrection is always that death is not the end. You know, there is this incredible hope that, because I know you talked about Revelation earlier, and, you know, there were a whole lot of people talking about, the end is near in 2020. Well, it certainly seemed it. Have we ever known everybody to be in lockdown around the world? I mean, you could certainly read all sorts of things as we read through Revelation for that, but actually it wasn't. And we're still here, and we still go with this hope, which for me is tied up in the resurrection, that death is not the end, and we continue to live our lives. And N.T. Wright, I actually wrote this quote down because I found this last night and thinking through, and I just love this. Jesus' resurrection is the beginning of God's new project, not to snatch people away from earth to heaven, but to colonize earth with the life of heaven. You've talked about that, haven't you, about the kingdom of God here now, but there's this beautiful picture in that of this God's new project, this renewal, and this all tied up in the resurrection. I mean, I do happen to like N.T. Wright. He often has a way of putting things with good imagery, and I frequently preach him. You do as well, you know. So it's a way of explaining.
And Tom Wright has written a huge book on the resurrection, which I haven't read yet.
Oh, maybe that's the summary of the whole. No, I think I'm sure you'll still gain by reading of N.T. Wright.
I feel like I should have read it as preparation for this because I think it wrestles with all the historicity issues and all that kind of stuff, but it's
because he does that, doesn't he?
He does,
He's
he is a historian technically, so and a Pauline scholar as well technically, but he does the whole thing because you can't talk about Paul without talking about Jesus. So it's like it'd be like talking about Michael Jordan without talking about basketball.
Just couldn't do it.
Yeah.
I listened to his little, not quite a podcast, but his little videos which come out from time to time. And he's very English, and he goes off to make a cup of tea. So he walks through the garden with his cup of tea. He sits there on the bench, and then he starts his. So here we are with our coffees and teas and doing a similar thing. He's very real.
One last thing I did want to throw in, because I think we are probably coming up towards, we've just crossed over the hour mark of recording, but we were rolling for a while before we came in, so who knows how long it's been. One thing I was thinking about is that something that the resurrection does that I think is really important is it subverts any desire that we might have for immortality.
Yeah.
Because if you want to stick around, you have to die. You have to come back with a different body. So the thing that I like about resurrection theology is that it gets you away from clinging to the life that you have now, which, and anyone who wants to save their life will lose it. It's, you're not necessarily losing this life. You're losing the next life that you would be resurrected into, which again you can view on a number of different levels. Because again we all have miniature resurrections, and who knows what'll happen when we physically die. What kind of resurrection may or may not be involved in that. Again, firmly on the I don't know team.
And another useful episode.
But definitely, as that quote, if you want to save your life, you'll lose it. And in that passage, there is a sense. This is written down. It's the words of Jesus written down, but it's written down years later when people are still alive, still around after Jesus has lived, died, resurrected, and ascended. He's now gone, and so they know that there's going to be generations of Christians who have to live their whole life waiting for God, and so when they say those who want to save their life will lose it. There's a sense in which they're saying not necessarily that you have to die in a mortal sense, but that your life has to be about that sacrifice. And if you want immortality, then it's about letting go of chasing glory, and it's about letting go of those things and actually embracing this life of self-sacrifice and self-sacrificial love.
Which is absolutely countercultural. Because it's all about striving for success and having the big house and the material stuff and looking.
Then you think about the people.
Having power.
You think about the people that we remember from our lives. Do you remember the people who were really clever, or do you remember the people that you really loved and the people that really loved you, the people that sacrificed and were loving for you? I think there's some wisdom in that, regardless of where you land on the resurrection. That.
Well, and again, it's just the literal part of it that I tend to find to be perhaps not always the most relevant in a lot of discussions. But theologically, it's very fertile ground.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And I make sense of it literally. I guess, and that would have been integral to my becoming a Christian to start with. Was the resurrection, accepting the resurrection, which is countercultural. We talked about that before.
I think I land somewhere between you both. I think I'm a little bit more ambivalent about it because I, as a modern Westerner, do find the concept of a resurrection difficult to imagine. Like transcendence is really hard for us to imagine in this day and age because we don't have any transcendence in our culture. Magic does not exist in our culture; it's dead. And so it's hard to imagine. So I actually find the resurrection hard to imagine, but I cling to it even when I struggle to believe it. I cling to it as something that I affirm that I believe because I need to believe it for what you've said about living a life having meaning, and also for death having meaning, and eternity. So. I guess that's why I land in between. I say it's very hard for me to believe, and often I have to state that I believe it even when I don't feel like I do, because it's so important to me.
It's a good way of putting it. And at the same time, I appreciate the needing not. I think what this discussion has said to me is that the literal meaning of the of the resurrection is not all there is. We have to remember that mystery and that grappling and that finding the kingdom of God here and now and the resurrection alive in our lives today as part of who we are as Christians. And you don't want to just go, oh yes, that's all done and dusted. The resurrection happened, don't need to talk about it anymore, because we do.
Our God needs to be bigger than our doctrine, and our God and we need to be flexible in our spirituality if we're going to be healthy. So, hence open-ended.
Yes, and the mystery is okay.
The mystery's good.
The mystery's actually good.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
I'm very uncomfortable with the mystery. I'm not sure I can say it's good, but it definitely exists.
Well, no, I'm uncomfortable with the mystery, and I think that's why it's good.
And I think that I'm becoming more and more comfortable with mystery. That when we talk about the mystery of God, to me, I just go, I don't have to get this all black and white. I don't have to understand it all, because there is mystery, and that's
definitely.
and you sit in that. It's just how we articulate it.
And I think I feel like with the mystery of it, I've gotten to a point where I'm okay having an answer if it's not the answer.
Yeah.
And the good thing about knowing that you won't ever get to the answer means that you can throw around all sorts of different just an answer and see what you can pull out of each of them. And that to me is where the joy of it tends to come from.
And often where we have to have an answer, which may not be the answer, is when the rubber hits the road in a practical sense, where we have to make a decision about something. And it's funny how you can sit on the fence, but when you're pushed to make a decision, then or you have to make a decision. And the resurrection's probably not one of those things where you're ever going to be pushed to make. No one's going to put a gun to your head and say, make a decision.
I mean, or if they do, then there's probably a whole bunch of context to that as well. There's been some big social upheaval, A lot of things have gone wrong before that point.
Not just that question, is it?
No.
So do you think we've answered the question, is the resurrection
Well, we've
real?
given an answer. It may not be the answer.
The answer is yes.
I think
Yeah, the answer is yes.
if you average all three of us out, the answer is probably.
I think, but it has been really good to chat through and I think we've wrestled with this one. We've had, and that's part of being open-ended, isn't it? That we don't just come and don't just talk about
boring,
what's right, because that's,
It's boring if we don't have a good fight.
We need to be able to wrestle with these issues and ask, well, what is the meaning of real to start with?
Yeah.
And, what do the scriptures say and what does that mean for our lives and so forth? That's the essence of open-ended.
Yeah. I mean, I could go on, but I think we could probably just leave it there as well.
Yeah, definitely.
So, good chat once again.
If you want to hear what I was about to say, tune in next series when we
Yeah, that's right, because it's leading to something.
That'll do. Then we'll just...
Thank you for joining us. Open Ended is directed and produced by JC Finlay for Adelaide West Uniting Church, with music by Tadra Abbott.
If you would like to participate in our online church services, they are available on the Adelaide West Uniting Church YouTube channel from 10 a.m. every Sunday, Adelaide time.
If you would like to get in touch with us, send an email to churchonline@awuc.au. And you can visit our website at awuc.au.